While Tesla built its empire on innovation and German automakers controlled markets through legacy, one Chinese company just made a decision that will reshape the entire industry. BYD didn't wage this war with a revolutionary technology or a flashy announcement. They weaponized something far more dangerous, the ability to mass produce electric vehicles at a cost nobody else can touch, then sell them for less than a gas car costs to fill up. And now, as the dust settles, industry analysts are predicting something most of us never thought possible, that up to 80% of car companies will simply cease to exist. What we're witnessing is not competition in the traditional sense. It's the systematic dismantling of an entire business model. The automotive industry has spent more than a century building barriers to entry so high that only a handful of corporations could survive. They built dealership networks, established brand loyalty, spent billions on factories, cultivated relationships with suppliers, and created legal structures that protected their territories. They made cars so complicated and expensive to produce that you needed massive capital, massive engineering teams, and massive market share just to break even. That fortress just crumbled in about 18 months. For the past 100 years, if you wanted to build a car company, you needed access to capital that only governments or massive financial institutions could provide. You needed to establish relationships with suppliers that took decades to build. You needed to navigate regulatory frameworks that were designed to protect existing manufacturers. You needed to build dealer networks that required massive upfront investment and territorial agreements. You needed to establish brand reputation through advertising and years of market presence. The cost to get to profitability was so high that it effectively prevented new competition. By the 1970s, the entire global industry had consolidated into maybe 20 major players. By the 2000s, it was down to about 10. The barriers were working exactly as they were designed to work. BYD's strategy is deceptively simple on the surface, but absolutely ruthless in execution. They looked at the electric vehicle market in 2025 and made a calculation that competitors couldn't stomach. They said, we're going to flood the domestic Chinese market with vehicles at margins so thin they're essentially non-existent. We're going to take market share at any cost. Or we're going to make price the primary weapon, undercut everyone by 30%, and accept that our profit per car might drop to almost nothing. This sounds insane if you're thinking like a traditional automaker. But BYD wasn't thinking like a traditional automaker anymore. They were thinking like a company that knows the game is about to change forever. The company had been building toward this moment for years. Starting in 2020, BYD began introducing new technologies and launching new models faster than its competitors. They invested heavily in battery manufacturing, in charging infrastructure, in vertical integration up and down the supply chain. They built factories. They acquired key suppliers. They brought multiple production lines online across different regions. By 2024, they were producing vehicles at scale that nobody had achieved before. They had the capacity, they had the supply chain control, and they had the cost structure advantages that would allow them to do something that traditional competitors simply couldn't do. In March 2026 alone, BYD slashed prices across its entire vehicle lineup by an average of 10%. But that number obscures the real story. They didn't cut all their cars by 10% uniformly. Some models got hit with discounts pushing towards 34%. Their Seagull, the ultra-affordable electric car that costs less than $10,000 in China, became what industry analysts are calling a volume monster. We're not talking about incremental sales here. We're talking about wholesale market transformation. Hundreds of new car models launched in the first 5 months of 2026, but overall retail volume actually dropped by nearly 20%. That means the models that survived and thrived were the ones priced most aggressively. The mathematics of what BYD has done would bankrupt a traditional automaker in weeks. When you're making cars and losing money on each unit, the only way to stay alive is volume. You need such overwhelming scale that your fixed costs get distributed across enough units to eventually turn that loss into profit. Most companies in this situation would be in deep trouble. But BYD doesn't operate under those constraints because they're not primarily a car company anymore. They're a battery company that also happens to manufacture vehicles. This is the crucial detail everyone misses. BYD produces its own batteries. They own the lithium processing. They control the supply chain from raw materials to finished product. When they sell a car at a loss, they're not taking a loss across the entire business. They're taking a loss on the car, but they're making substantial margins on the battery pack inside it. They're also selling charging infrastructure. They're building the entire ecosystem. So when they price a car at what looks like a suicidal price point, they're actually playing a completely different game than someone like Volkswagen or General Motors, who have to buy batteries from suppliers and pay those costs up front. This vertical integration is what gives BYD the asymmetric advantage. A traditional automaker looks at BYD's prices and can't compete because they'd lose money on every unit. BYD looks at traditional automakers and sees companies that have already lost. The game changed. Most players didn't realize they were playing by the old rules anymore. Consider what happens when you try to compete with BYD as a traditional automaker. You design a vehicle, you source components from suppliers, you negotiate battery costs, you build the vehicle in factories you own or operate, you ship it through logistics networks, you sell it through dealers who take their cut. Your margin needs to be high, enough to cover all of those layers, all of that overhead, all of that complexity. By the time you've accounted for your research and development costs, your corporate infrastructure, your shareholder expectations, you need to make a substantial profit on each car just to stay in business. Now imagine you're BYD. You design the vehicle in-house, you make the batteries in your own factories, you source critical minerals from suppliers you control, you build the car in your factories with your systems, you ship it yourself, you sell it directly or through a simplified dealer network. You capture all the value at every step. When you cut a price, you're not cutting into margin that has to cover external suppliers and external logistics and external sales infrastructure. You're operating a completely different business model. The economics are inverted. A price that would bankrupt a traditional automaker is sustainable, even profitable, for BYD. But here's where the strategy becomes genuinely brilliant, because the domestic market is just the first act. BYD absolutely knew that flooding China with cheap electric vehicles would eventually hit saturation. By mid-2026, the company was facing what every rapid growth manufacturer eventually faces: a market running out of new customers. The Chinese domestic market has nearly 55 million vehicles in annual production capacity, but only about 23 million in actual demand. That's a massive overhang of idle factories and desperate manufacturers. BYD's response was to look outward. The company revised its overseas sales target to 1.5 million vehicles in 2026. 1.5 million. For context, Tesla's entire global delivery in 2025 was around 1.8 million vehicles. BYD was essentially saying, we're going to build an export business of Tesla. Scale proportions in a single year. By June 2026, overseas sales had already reached 43% of BYD's total monthly sales in just 1 month. They'd gone from exports being a marginal part of the business to being nearly half of it. Vehicles were flowing into Southeast Asia, Latin America, Europe, and Africa. The genius of the global strategy is that it solves the profitability problem without requiring BYD to retreat from pricing aggression at home. See, here's the trap that traditional manufacturers can't escape. They need China to be profitable because that's where their volume is. If they cut prices too aggressively in China, they destroy their margins globally. But BYD doesn't have that constraint. They can take domestic losses because they're making them up in overseas markets where the same car sells for double or triple the Chinese price. Take the Auto 3, for example. In China, this vehicle sells for less than $20,000. In Germany, which is BYD's primary European market, the same car sells for over $41,000. The difference isn't inflation or market positioning. It's that BYD can sell at whatever price it wants domestically because volume is what matters, and then sell at premium prices. Internationally, because Europeans perceive the car as a Chinese import competing against German and European brands. The perception premium is massive. So what you're looking at is a company that's essentially transferring value from the Chinese market to overseas markets. They're losing money per car at home, but making huge money per car abroad. This is value arbitrage at the global scale. BYD understood that the perception of quality, reliability, and prestige around automobiles is regional and cultural. In Europe, a German car commands a premium. In China, a Chinese car sells on price and availability. BYD doesn't try to compete on prestige against German manufacturers in Europe. They compete on value. They say, here's a vehicle with the same safety, the same reliability, the same technology, and it costs $30,000 less. That pitch works because it's true and because the European customer isn't paying a prestige premium. They're buying a product. BYD is selling the product. Meanwhile, in China, they're flooding the market with volume, taking market share, building brand loyalty among younger consumers who don't care about historical prestige. By June 2026, BYD had grown to operating in over 100 countries across 400 cities. That's not just a sales presence, that's infrastructure. That's dealerships, service networks, charging stations, logistics chains, brand recognition, and customer bases building across the world. JP Morgan analysts estimated that this export strategy was improving BYD's average selling price by thousands of yuan per unit. The margin math was completely different when you averaged the high-volume, low-margin domestic sales with the lower-volume, high-margin international sales. The company that looked like it was headed toward bankruptcy in China was actually building a global profit engine. Then something remarkable happened. In the second quarter of 2026, BYD officially retook the global battery electric vehicle crown from Tesla. Not through innovation, not through brand prestige, not through technological superiority in any single category. They retook it through ruthless execution of a strategy that traditional automakers can't copy because it requires abandoning everything. They believe about how the business works. Tesla looked at the problem of electric vehicle dominance as an engineering challenge and a supply chain challenge. BYD looked at it as a scale challenge and a vertical integration challenge. They asked, how do we make the most vehicles from the most integrated supply chain at the lowest possible cost as fast as possible? That's a different question entirely, and the answer is terrifying if you're a competitor. The impact on the industry has been instantaneous and brutal. In the first quarter of 2026 alone, BYD's net profit fell 55% compared to the same quarter the previous year. It was the lowest profit in over 3 years, despite massive volume increases. Q2 wasn't better. Net income tumbled nearly 30% to 6.36 billion yuan, about 800s. $92 million. Sounds enormous until you realize that's on revenue of 201 billion yuan. That's a gross margin of only 18%, down from 18.8% the year before. The automaker had sacrificed profitability on the altar of market share, and it was working exactly as planned. But here's where we need to understand what that sacrifice actually means. Because BYD's profit was falling, but it wasn't falling towards zero. It was falling in a controlled way. The company was managing the descent. They knew exactly how much margin compression they could absorb because they understood their cost structure and their vertical integration advantages better than anyone else. Meanwhile, traditional automakers were facing margin compression they couldn't control. They couldn't match BYD's prices without destroying their profitability, so they had to retreat from price competition. Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, General Motors, Ford, all of these companies made uncomfortable announcements during 2026 about reducing their EV investments, slowing their electrification timelines, or focusing on hybrid vehicles instead. They weren't making these announcements because they didn't believe in electric vehicles. They were making them because they were watching their margins get destroyed by competition from a company that simply had a better cost structure. You can't compete on price when your competitor can undercut you by 30% and still make money because they own the battery supply chain. The Chinese government tried to intervene. In mid-2025, regulators began cracking down on what they called neizhuan, which translates roughly to internal cannibalism. It's the Chinese term for what happens when companies destroy value by competing too aggressively on price with each other. Officials convened meetings with more than a dozen automakers and pressed them to stop the price war. It didn't work. BYD kept cutting prices. By April 2026, Chinese authorities issued another warning to the industry. They urged executives to end what they described as a destructive cycle where everyone loses. They talked about protecting the supply chain and preserving the global reputation of Chinese manufacturing. It was completely ineffective. You can't regulate away competitive advantage. You can't legislate a company into abandoning a winning strategy. If BYD's strategy is working, and all the data suggests it absolutely is, then asking them to stop competing on price is like asking a predator to stop hunting. The government warnings were theater. Everyone knew it, including the government. The only way this ends is when competitors have no choice but to adapt or exit. The regulatory response from the Chinese government was limited because BYD effectively serves the government's interests. China wants to dominate global automotive. China wants electric vehicles as the global standard. China wants its companies leading that transition. BYD is doing exactly that. The government can talk about protecting other manufacturers, but they won't seriously hamper BYD's advantage. Western governments took a different approach. They used tariffs and subsidies to protect manufacturers. The United States imposed tariffs on Chinese EVs. The European Union did the same. They provided subsidies for domestic EV production and created tax incentives for local vehicles. It's protectionism as industrial policy. It might save a few manufacturers from immediate collapse, but it won't solve the underlying problem. You can't tariff your way out of a better business model. You can only delay the inevitable. That's where the 80% prediction comes in. Industry analysts, looking at the current trajectory, are suggesting that the vast majority of automobile manufacturers simply won't survive the next 5 to 10 years. We're not talking about small brands or emerging companies. We're talking about established automakers that have been around for decades. The basis for this prediction is straightforward. If you can't compete on price because you don't have BYD's cost structure, and you can't compete on technology because Chinese manufacturers are matching innovation at a faster pace, then what's your competitive moat? What's keeping customers coming to you instead of going to a company that's offering a vehicle for half the price? The traditional answer is brand loyalty and dealer networks and service infrastructure. But electric vehicles are simpler than internal combustion vehicles. They have fewer moving parts, they need less service, they can be sold directly without dealerships. The entire relationship between customer and Manufacturer is changing. A teenager in India or Southeast Asia doesn't care that Volkswagen has been around for 100 years. They care that BYD is offering a vehicle they can actually afford that will actually work. Brand heritage is a liability now, not an asset, because it comes with massive legacy costs. The consolidation that's about to happen will be extraordinary. Some automakers will merge to try to achieve scale. Some will exit entire markets. Some will become pure luxury brands, serving the wealthy who care about prestige regardless of price. Some will become manufacturers for Chinese. Companies, building vehicles under contract because they can't compete as independent brands. Some will simply disappear. The number that will emerge from this period as independent, profitable, global automakers competing across all segments is probably in the low single digits, maybe 5 or 6 major players globally, maybe fewer. BYD's recent product announcements reinforce this picture of a company that's not just competing, but actively building the future. In late July 2026, they confirmed plans to unveil a humanoid robot in early August. The BYD Dahan, their flagship sedan, boasts a range of up to 1,008 kilometers, more than many drivers need to weigh. Fully charge a vehicle in a year? The Denza Z9S began pre-orders with up to 920 kilometers of range. These aren't innovations because they're doing something nobody else can do technically. They're innovations because they're doing things at price points and with efficiency that competitors can't match. The robotics move is particularly significant because it signals that BYD has moved beyond thinking of itself as an automaker. They're thinking about automated manufacturing, automated delivery, automated handling. They're thinking about a future where the marginal cost of building a vehicle drops even further because robots do more of it. This is the next frontier of cost reduction. They're not done cutting costs. They haven't even started. What makes this moment historically significant is that it represents a fundamental power shift in the global economy. For decades, developed economies have assumed that they own advanced manufacturing. The idea that you go to Germany for cars, to Switzerland for watches, to Italy for fashion, to Japan for electronics, it's been the economic default setting for generations. But that assumption was always based on relative cost advantages. Germany had engineering talent and industrial infrastructure that developing countries didn't have. So German companies could price vehicles higher and still dominate. That advantage has evaporated. China now has the engineering talent, the industrial infrastructure, the vertical integration, the scale, and crucially, the willingness to operate on margins that Western companies find unacceptable. The cost of capital is different. The regulatory environment is different. The labor costs are different. The government support is different. All of these factors combine to create a competitive advantage that can't be overcome by doing things incrementally better. You'd have to reinvent your entire business model, and most companies don't have the stomach for that. The United States and Europe have responded with trade barriers, higher tariffs on Chinese EVs, restrictions on imports, subsidies for domestic manufacturers. These are logical responses from a protectionist standpoint. If you can't compete on price, then you use government power to block the competition. It buys time. It might save a few legacy automakers, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem, which is that Chinese manufacturers have built better business models. You can't tariff your way to a better business model. You can only delay the inevitable. BYD's expansion into these protected markets is already beginning. They opened a factory in Hungary with the intention of producing vehicles in Europe. They're targeting the United Kingdom and Germany with affordable EVs. They're working with governments in Southeast Asia and Latin America on manufacturing partnerships. They're not going to be completely shut out of any major market. Even if tariffs are high, they'll find ways to establish local production, local partnerships, local supply chains. The barrier to entry for new competitors in manufacturing was high when you needed to own massive factories. It's lower when you're essentially licensing your vertical integration advantages to local manufacturers. The human element of this transformation is worth understanding too. At some point, if you're working for Volkswagen or Ford or General Motors, you have to confront the reality that your company might not exist in its current form in 5 years. That creates a certain gallows humor in those organizations. It also creates talent drain. The smartest engineers and the most ambitious managers start looking for exits. They go to EV startups. They go to tech companies entering the automotive space. They go to Chinese manufacturers. This accelerates the decline because the companies that need the best talent most are the ones losing it fastest. The price war itself, while brutal, is actually stabilizing certain parts of the industry. Cheap electric vehicles are faster than expensive ones. A $20,000 electric car from BYD is going to convert an internal combustion driver faster than a $60,000 Tesla. The speed of electrification is accelerating because price is collapsing. So while the number of automakers is shrinking, the actual transition away from fossil fuels is happening faster. There's a perverse positive outcome hidden inside the devastation. But let's be clear about what's happening here. This is not free market competition in any romantic sense. This is a Chinese company with government support, vertical integration advantages, and a willingness to operate on razor-thin margins, destroying Western companies that have fundamentally different cost structures and different expectations about profitability. It's market warfare. It's very effective market warfare. And Western governments and companies are only beginning to understand the scale of the challenge they're facing. BYD will probably see its profit margins improve over the next few years as scale increases and overseas sales grow. The company itself will likely emerge from this period more profitable and more dominant than ever. But the automotive industry as a whole will have gone through a consolidation more severe than anything seen since the industry's founding. The list of household names that won't make it through is already partially determined. Some of it depends on government policy, some on merger decisions, some on how quickly companies can restructure. But the direction is set. The game is over. BYD just finished teaching everyone the new rules. What happens next is execution. BYD needs to maintain its cost advantages while establishing premium brand positioning in developed markets. It needs to keep innovating on battery technology and range and charging speed while maintaining price discipline. It needs to navigate geopolitical risks, especially around access to critical minerals and regulatory restrictions in the United States. It needs to build dealer networks and service infrastructure in markets where it has no historical presence. These are all doable problems for a company with BYD's resources and determination, but they're not trivial. For everyone else, the challenge is different. Do you try to compete with BYD directly? That's probably a losing game unless you have some equivalent structural advantage. Do you merge with other companies to achieve scale? Maybe, but you're probably just combining two weak competitors into one. Slightly less weak competitor. Do you exit the mass market and focus on premium or luxury vehicles? That works for some companies, but it reduces your total addressable market. Do you become a manufacturer for someone else? That's humiliating, but increasingly necessary for a lot of companies. The window for adaptation is probably 5 to 10 years. After that, the structure of the industry will be set. The winners will be established, the losers will have exited, and the new normal will feel inevitable in hindsight. People will look back at this period and wonder why it took companies so long to respond. They'll see BYD's strategy as obvious and inevitable. They'll think that any competent manager should have seen this coming from miles away. And they'll be partially right. The warning signs were there. The cost structure advantages were visible. The speed of innovation in China was accelerating. But organizational inertia is powerful, and it's very difficult to admit that the business model you've spent decades building is fundamentally broken. BYD has effectively declared war on every car company by refusing to play by the old rules. They're not trying to beat competitors within the existing framework. They're trying to destroy the framework itself. They're making the entire notion of a premium price for automotive manufacturing obsolete. They're proving that you don't need 100 years of brand heritage to sell cars. You need reliable vehicles at accessible prices and a supply chain optimized for speed and cost. That's it. Everything else is legacy overhead. The remarkable thing is how quickly this shift has happened. Just 2 years ago, the idea that BYD would retake the global EV crown from Tesla seemed far-fetched. The idea that Western automakers would be struggling to compete on price seemed unlikely. The idea that 80% of car manufacturers would face elimination seemed impossible. Now it's just reality. Now it's just the thing that's happening. The war was declared not with fanfare, but with price cuts and factory expansions and vertical integration decisions made in conference rooms that nobody outside the company ever heard about. And now that the war is visible, it's too late to fight back.